OECD's Education at a Glance 2018. My name is Miguel Gorman. I'm the Acting Deputy Head of Center here at the OECD's Washington Center. And we're delighted to host this briefing today with Andrea Schleicher, the Director for Education and Skills at OECD headquarters in Paris. Education at a Glance, of course, is the leading international compendium of comparable national statistics measuring the state of education in OECD member and partner countries. And very soon I'm going to hand things over to Andreas so he can begin the presentation. But first, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. In order to ask a question during the Q&A portion of this briefing, you will need to be logged into the web briefing and click on the raise hand icon. That will allow us to unmute your line and let you ask your questions. If you can't call in using your computer's microphone, you can send your questions via the Q&A box and we will see them there. If you have any technical trouble at all, please do call or contact GoToWebinar support. They are extremely helpful. Next, we're going to hear from Andrea Schleicher, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. Today's briefing in total should take about 45 minutes. Andreas, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Miguel, and good morning to everyone. This is about the results from our 2018 edition, which covers data from 2015 to 17, depending on the indicator that I'm going to talk about. We have put a special focus on inequality, equity in this year's edition of Education at a Glance, and one way to look at this is by what happens at the school level. The red cross on the chart shows you situations where children from where the share of children achieving the minimum level of 2 at the PISA mathematics test is basically that's the ratio between the privileged and less privileged students achieving those kinds of results. And you can see in virtually every country the figure is below 1. Often in the area of 20%, 0.8 here, showing that children from disadvantaged backgrounds at age 15 have a lower rate of chance to achieve the minimum level of mathematics performance. On gender, we see a rather even picture in most countries, boys and girls at age 15 achieving similar results. And then the blue dot shows you how this plays out by location. The United States is an interesting case together with the UK. It's a country where sort of cities have probably more push than pull factors, whereas in the majority of countries, it works the other way around. If you live in a large city, you are more likely to get a better education than if you live in a rural area. But as you can see on all dimensions, significant levels of inequality. We've also seen in most countries very little change on this. Where you see a green arrow here, it means socioeconomic inequality and mathematics performance has improved. And you can see that sort of by a slight amount for the United States. Where the red bar is going down, it has decreased. And as you can see, overall, there hasn't been that much change in the majority of countries over the period 2006 to 2015. Inequality early in education and in school can have an impact on people's life chances. And one of the things that you actually see is when you look to the left side of the chart, these are largely countries with relatively lower levels of overall education attainment. What you can see there is that the percentage of adults earning more than the median at the respective level of education is much higher. So basically, the educational qualifications play out much more into earnings advantages than is the case on the right side of the chart, where levels of education tend to be higher. So having more people with better skills in the population seems to associate it with smaller differentials between the earnings benefits by educational qualification. We've also looked at gender and education. First of all, in the US, as in most other countries, there are now more women than men who enter tertiary education. We can also see that in absolute terms, there are huge differences across countries. In the United States, it's around half of the population that enters into tertiary programs in many countries is now way beyond that. In some cases, you can see among the women close to 80% entering into some form of academic or vocational tertiary programs. So huge differences in absolute terms, but also some difference by gender, typically in favor of women. So adding one more dimension, that's sort of the long-term consequences. One of the things we see is that women, even if they are tertiary educated, are more likely to be inactive. Now, what you see here is a gender difference in inactivity rate. So basically, this is looking for work or being in employment. It's activity rate. And what you can see here is that on the left side of the chart, mostly, you can see big differentials. On the right side, smaller differentials. But in virtually every country, except Korea, you can see that for tertiary educated people, gender differences in activity or inactivity are much smaller. So if you have a university degree as a woman or a man, you're more likely to be employed. Whereas if you do not have a baseline qualification, no high school degree, you can see really that being a woman is a significant disadvantage in terms of higher levels of inactivity. So education plays out quite differently for the genders when it comes to employment. Another way to look at this is earnings. You can see on average across countries, women earn 26% less than men. Women who have tertiary qualifications and also who have a kind of full-time work. And that's basically a story of different choices being made by field of study and so on. And what you can say for the US also here, that there is a quite important a gap between pay of men and women, often as a result of choices in different study, even for full-time equivalents. And the consequence of that, in turn, is lower earnings for women, even if they have a tertiary degree. You can see in the case of the US, the earnings returns are very strong. Your labor market is very flexible, very responsive to skills. If you have great skills, the labor market actually does pay you for that. And but you can see that's true more for men than it's for women. And often, men have chosen fields of studies that are more in demand by the labor market and therefore lead to higher lifetime earnings. And what we have done here is already taken out the cost side of it. So tuition and so on is taken into account of that. We've also looked at immigration and education. And one thing you can see is that the employment rates of native and foreign-born people can be quite different. In many countries, you can see people who arrived in the country by the age of 15, they're still at a disadvantage, even though they came in quite young. In the US, that's not visible, but what you can see is that people in the US who arrived in the country at 16 or older have a kind of disadvantage in terms of employment rate, and that's true for most other countries as well. We also see, and that's really interesting, when you look at the earnings of foreign-born workers as a percentage of the earnings of native-born full-time workers, you can see that for people who have not completed high school or completed high school, you still have an earnings disadvantage as a kind of foreign worker. On the other hand, in the United States, different from most other countries, if you have a tertiary qualification, it's playing out more or less the same. What can we do to improve equity? Well, first of all, we've seen that equity can actually, access to tertiary education has improved a lot in a number of countries. In the US, a little bit, not as much as on average across countries, but you can see if you add up, short-cycled courses, that's the kind of associate degree program, for example, a vocational program. If you add up bachelor's, master's, and doctors, you get close to sort of 50%. What is striking for the US, there are only about 12% of young Americans who attain a master's or doctorate compared to 15% on average across countries. So while If you add kind of everything up, the US comes out well. At the kind of more advanced qualifications, the US is now below the OECD average. I'm saying this because if you look at historical patterns, the US always used to be at the front of all of that. But as you can see, things have changed. Some other countries have now very impressive kind of outputs that have been translated into the attainment levels at the age group 25 to 34 years that we're looking here at this chart. We also see something that interesting when you look at the age distribution of new entrants into tertiary education. What you can see in the United States, they're all basically very young. Even the 80th percentile is only 19 years. There are some other countries where people start, at a much broader range of ages. And that's not by accident. In some of the countries, tertiary education is now deliberately being redesigned to cater for learners with very different needs and also to foster continuing education and training. So people, starting their life sometimes with a more occupational oriented program and then later on go back to university. So life-wide learning is becoming sort of more of a reality. And you can see that reflected in a wider range of ages when people enter their study. In some countries, not in all. We, for the first time, looked a little bit in a little bit more detail about the skills value of degrees. What you see on this chart is basically the skills that people have. We tested adults in their numeracy skills. In green, you see basically the score on the test for people who have a university qualification and who work in a job that also needs a university qualification. We call them well matched. In blue, I show you the test scores from people who have a tertiary qualification, but who work in a job that wouldn't need it. And what you can see, for example, in the US, but also many other countries, is that the skills of those who are formally overqualified are actually a lot lower than the skills of those who are well matched. Now, one interpretation would be that, you don't use your skills and therefore you lose some of them. Perhaps a little bit of that is true. But the bigger question arising here is, what about the value of the initial qualification people got in the first place? One indication of the lower blue bar could be that there are people who got a degree, but the degree wasn't worth it in terms of the skills that were actually attained. So people went to university, got a degree, but they didn't get the kind of skills they would need in a kind of degree level job. The truth is perhaps in the middle. There may also be other factors at play, but I think these data raise the question, particularly in countries with a high share of overqualified people. They raise that kind of question. The United States also is among the countries where we see significant overqualification, but actually very little overskilling. You have very few people, now less than 5 in 100, who have actually better skills than what they need in the current job. But you have a high share of people who have better qualifications than what they need in their current job. So there is some sort of all of this together suggests to us that there is probably, a lot of variability in the skills value of degrees and qualifications. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, at the early years, you can see enrollment of 3 to 5-year-olds has increased by a very large margin in a number of countries, on average by 10 percentage points. And you can see this is an area where the United States trails quite a bit behind. You have only Greece, Costa Rica, Switzerland, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia with lower levels of enrollment. And that used to be quite different. When you look at the figures in 2005, the United States was still in good company, but many countries have expanded access and often also quality in early childhood education and care, quality as measured by things like staff qualifications and so on. We also have data on the youngest children, 0 to 3 years in this edition of Education at a Glance, but unfortunately, we don't have data for the US on those. Looking at spending patterns, overall, when you basically add up spending from public and private sources across the different levels of education, the United States ends up kind of as one of the high spending countries, over 6% of GDP going into education institutions. You compare that, with countries like the Russian Federation, where that is just about half of that figure. So very big differences in the volume of national resources that are invested in education. How is that money being spent? This is the share of spending that goes into infrastructure, capital spending for primary schooling, and then in orange for tertiary education. And you can see that's not a big part of spending in the United States. Actually, what I'm showing highlighted here is the United Kingdom. When I look at the United States, it's not a high share of spending in the United States, but pretty close to the average. But when I go into kind of tertiary level capital spending, a number of countries invest significant amounts of money in resources, in infrastructure, laboratories, buildings, and things like that. When you look at investment in advanced skills, where does the money come from? The United States is among the countries where a large part of spending on tertiary institutions, on universities, comes from households, through tuition, and there are different groups of countries. If you think about, Chile, Japan, and Korea, for example, on the right side, they are similar to the US in the share of spending that comes from private sources, but basically parents are very much on their own, or students are on their own. They have to mobilize the money through commercial loans. If you go to the United States, there is some access to public money for students, Pell Grants and things like this. If you go to the United Kingdom or Australia or New Zealand, every student gets a publicly guaranteed loans, and they are income contingent, so you only pay back once your income has received a fairly decent level. So different ways to recuperate those kinds of costs. We need to keep that in mind, that actually private spending can be guaranteed in very different ways. You can also look at changes in public and private spending. You can see, for example, spending from public sources in the United States declined between 2010 and 2015, but spending from private sources increased. So overall, we have not seen that much kind of level in the kind of spending patterns. Looking at the foundations, the early years, when you look at spending on early childhood education and care, you would have inferred that from the very low participation rates. You can see in the United States, relatively little money is going into pre-primary education as a percentage of GDP. You look to Sweden, it's basically, it's a full percentage point higher than what you see in the United States. Varying degrees of investment. When you do that for schooling, you can see that also here, different, actually I should say, whereas the United States does not spend much on the early years, overall in the schooling sector, where participation is much higher, also spending per student is much higher, and that gives you sort of total high levels of total overall spending only after Luxembourg, Austria, and Norway. How is the money being spent? The United States stand out is that a smaller share of money goes into the compensation of teachers. Then elsewhere, more money goes into the compensation of non-teaching staff and also other current expenditure. But it's particularly the non-teaching staff component that has more weight in the US than in many other countries, making the share of spending on teachers, relatively speaking, smaller. And that brings me to sort of student learning conditions, teacher working conditions. The first thing we can look at is compulsory instruction time. And you can see school days in the United States are fairly long. So when you look at the total number of compulsory instruction hours in a year, the United States ranks fourth after Australia, Denmark, and Costa Rica. Sort of large volume of time. Now, however, when we square that with the PISA results, we don't see much of a relationship, honestly. There are countries like the United Arab Emirates, number one in terms of hours of learning, but actually students learn very little in a lot of time. On the other hand, you have countries like Finland, like Switzerland, like Germany, like Estonia, like Japan, where learning hours actually are quite modest, but students learn a lot in very little time, according to the PISA data. So one has to look at this in a quite nuanced way. We can put the picture all together, and this is really interesting. When I look at the contributions of different factors to the salary cost of teachers, and I calculate it per student so that I can compare it across countries, one way in which you can spend money is to pay your teachers relatively well. And the United States is an example of this. In fact, by international standards, when you compare the monetary amounts, this looks like a good salary. When you look at this relative to salaries of other university-educated workers, actually the United States spends relatively little. That's a different story. But overall, in absolute terms, is a cost factor. Another way how you can spend money is to have long school days. And as I already showed you, this is the case for the United States. That adds to funding, puts more pressures on the system. The red bar is going up. In other countries where the red bar is going down, basically school days are shorter. A third way in which you can spend money is to give teachers time for other things than teaching. And that's not the case in the United States. In the United States, working days are long for teachers, and the relative share of time that teachers spend teaching is very high as well. And that's lowering the cost. That's an advantage of the system. But, be careful. Many of the high-performing education systems have a different arrangement. They basically leave teachers more time for other things than teaching than is the case in the United States. There could be, working with individual students, there could be working with parents, that could be engaging in professional development, lots of things being happening. But for example, a Japanese teacher teaches less than half of the time an American teacher teaches, but they work actually even longer days than American teachers, and therefore can spend a lot of time on, individual students and their families and so on. And that brings me to the last component, class size. Where the green bar goes down, classes are relatively large. Where the green bar goes up, basically smaller classes add to the cost pressures. You can see, for example, take a high-performing country like the Netherlands. You can see a lot of money is going into salaries. Now that's driving costs up. Teachers are expensive. They want to attract great people into the profession. They also want to give students more time, so the red bar goes up as well. But the Netherlands saves money by actually having larger classes, and it also saves money by having teachers teach a little bit more. You compare that, for example, with you could look at Greece, for example. It's almost exactly the mirror image. In Greece, basically, classes are very small. That's the biggest cost driver. Then you have also teachers not teaching so many hours, so that adds to the cost. But even Greece can spend its money only once, and the outcome is that salaries are poor and students don't have much time for learning. So you can see really how different countries make different spending choices. It's not so much that the amount of money being spent varies only, but it's also that the way in which resources are deployed can be very, very different. Now, that was the overall picture, but we can look at teacher working conditions in isolation. Here you see salaries relative to the basically earnings of tertiary educated workers, and that's where the United States trails really far behind. Basically, only the Slovak and Czech Republic pay their teachers less well relative to other people with similar qualifications. And there are only very few countries, Luxembourg, Portugal, Greece, where you can say you're better off as a teacher than another university graduate. In most countries, slightly less. But in very few countries, the difference is as big as it is in the United States. And in addition, I mentioned that already, teachers not only don't get paid so well, but they also have a very high number of teaching hours and a relatively or above average share of total working time spent teaching. So American teachers don't get, great pay relative to other workers, and they also have fewer opportunities to engage with other teachers in collaborative professional development, to do lesson study, to work with individual students, and so on. So that is perhaps a drag on the attractiveness of the teaching profession. One of the things that you can see from this chart, that there is actually a trade-off, a choice to be made between things like class sizes and salary cost. You can spend your money only once. You can see really clearly that countries that have higher salaries often trade in larger classes, and so that illustrates those kind of choices really need to be made. For the very first time, we've been looking into leadership, and what you can see here is the kind of spread of teacher salaries in blue, and then I compare that with the minimum salary of principals and the high end of the principal pay schedule. And what you can say, I said that teachers are not so well paid in the US, but principals, things look okay. Basically not as good as in England or the Netherlands or Luxembourg, but you can see that there's a clear distinction between the salaries of principals and those of teachers, and that probably in countries where schools have significant responsibilities, that is probably an important thing to take into consideration. Second but last point, how are decisions being made? Who makes decisions in a system? We looked at the school, and you can see, for example, in the Netherlands, Czech Republic, England, and so on, the majority of decisions is made at the level of the school, whereas in the United States, schools have, relatively speaking, less discretion. Only about 15-16% of all of the decisions that we looked at are taking place in schools by principals, whereas you have a lot more decisions done at the local level, that's your school district, and then a little bit at the state or the kind of central government. Now, basically, the bulk of decisions in the US get made at district levels, but actual schools have much less discretion than is the case in many other countries, actually in the majority of countries. We also, I'm going to skip that. So to come to the last part that looks at internationalization. What you can see here is that are about now 3.5 million students studying in OECD countries like the United States, and another 1.5 million in other countries. And that number keeps steadily rising. Higher education keeps to become a more international domain. We can also look at the market shares of different students, at least no, this is not the market share. This is the share of international students, international graduate by level of education in a country. And you can see, for example, in Luxembourg, you're talking about 30% of the first-time graduates being international students. Australia, New Zealand, Austria, UK are also very strong, very impressive on this. Whereas in the United States, sort of the share of international students is sort of around the OECD average, actually slightly less now. At the bachelor's level, then of course, you can look at this at the master's level, where the US has a slightly higher share of international students, and the same is true for PhDs. Picture sort of around the OECD average, but as you can see in Luxembourg, Australia, New Zealand, those numbers are significantly higher. And that's sort of in a nutshell the main results from this year's edition, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Andreas, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. Just before we move to the Q&A portion, a couple of further housekeeping items. Some of you have been asking about the presentation. Andreas has already tweeted his presentation earlier. You can find it on Twitter. His handle is at SchleicherOECD, SCHLEICHEROECD. And the report is online, oecd.org/education. And you will find in the handout section of the webinar a couple of country notes for the US and Canada. If you want to ask a question, please click on the raise hand button and we will be able to unmute your line. If you can't find that, or you're unable to find the button, you can also ask your question via the Q&A dashboard here on the webinar. One further announcement before we go to the Q&A part. If you're in Washington or even in the US, Andreas is going to be at the Future Ed think tank, part of the Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy, doing an event next Tuesday, September 18th at 10 a.m. To talk about OECD's work in education and that is September 18th at 10 a.m. It's going to be webcast also, futures-ed.org. Once again, if you want to ask a question, please click on the raise hand button or ask in the Q&A. Andreas, we have a question from Patrick O'Donnell. Do you see any advantages to how the US funds tertiary education, with most costs falling to individuals?
Yeah, in principle, I think that has advantages. One advantage is that when you put the money in the hands of students, that they are probably more demanding consumers. You can also say that it puts some degree of pressure on students themselves to complete their studies on time and so on. I think sort of having money flowing through students is in principle, I think, quite a good thing. The question is then how you reconcile this with equity and fairness. How do you ensure that the best and brightest get the best places and not the wealthiest? And that's an area where I think the US can do better. It can learn from, for example, from the UK, where you have a combination of, income contingent loans, means tested grants that actually make it very easy for people to get access to resources and risk-free access to resources, and they then pay back depending, once they have have a good job. So I think it's not so. I think there's an advantage of having private money, but reconciling this with equity is an issue. The other point, I think, where the US, in my view, has challenges is that fees have become sort of exorbitant. Basically, what universities are doing, they extract from students the kind of projected lifetime earnings, which of course are very high. It pays off very significantly for people to go to university, because it's selective. These are bright people who would have probably earned also a lot without even a degree. So basically, universities capitalize on many of the advantages that belong to people, while they should only charge you for the value they add. And again, some countries like Australia, UK have addressed this by imposing fee structures that would, not allow universities to charge higher tuition than their services to students are worth it.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, for your question. If you have questions, do raise your hand and we will unmute your line, or feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Andreas, I have a question for you. In one of the earlier slides, I was wondering what accounts for the large difference in earnings potential for immigrants with a college education across various countries. Is it an issue of recognition of qualifications?
Yeah, I think that this is a good question. There are several factors at play. First of all, the general ability of the labor market to extract value from skills varies hugely. In many countries, you have sort of wage compression in very different forms of shapes, could be through tax systems, social benefits, and things like this. But then also, often, if for students with an immigrant background, they may enter into issues of not having their degree being recognized at the same level. And so I think both factors could be at play.
Thank you very much. Andreas, Patrick O'Donnell has a follow-up question. I believe I know the answer, but he is asking if we have any chart or data with tertiary US education by state.
These data exist, actually, but we don't have them in education at a glance.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Catherine Bennett. Does table D6.1 comparing school decisions from national to school level account for the decision only? For example, many US decisions are made at the national level, but states/schools have to decide how to implement them. What does this mean for equity?
Yeah, what we actually we have actually a quite sort of fine-grained distinction here. We look at whether, for example, a school makes a decision in full autonomy, whether it makes a decision after consultation with other areas, other levels in the education systems, or whether it makes a decision within a framework that is established, for example, by the state or by the federal government. But even after accounting for all of this, there is actually, relatively speaking, less discretion for decisions to be made by schools. Now, the question on equity is a really interesting one. One could hypothesize that where schools have more room to maneuver, there's also a greater, this is a potential source for greater inequality. This is not actually what we observe. In fact, you can look at some countries with the highest share of decisions made by schools, like the Netherlands or like Hong Kong or like Flanders. Those are actually very equitable education systems. What they do is that they basically have a high share of, charter schools or voucher schools, but those schools operate within a quite tightly regulated framework, so that there are common educational standards, there may be common quality assurance systems, and so on. So having schools making local decisions is not automatically associated with a greater degree of inequality. Probably the opposite. Actually, some of the most centralized education systems turn out to be actually as some of the most inequitable ones.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes left on this webinar. If there are any final questions, please do type them in the Q&A box or raise your hand to ask. In the meantime, another question that was asked privately, yes, there will be a recording of this webinar available afterwards, and we will contact all of you who have attended this webinar with the link. There don't seem to be any final questions, so I will just remind everyone that the report is available at oecd.org/education, and click on the link for Education at a Glance. The country notes for the US and Canada are available here in the handouts section. And if you do have any questions after the webinar, you are free to contact us here at the Washington Center, washington.contact@oecd.org. Andreas, unless you have any final thoughts.
Not from me, no, but thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.